In the late summer of 1943, deep within the rolling plains of occupied Eastern Europe, the German Wehrmacht maintained an intricate network of forward repair depots, places where the tired and broken machines of the Eastern Front came to be mended, refitted, or stripped for parts. Among these men were mechanics of the 3rd Panzer Division, men whose grease-stained hands and weary eyes kept the great engines of war running while battles raged miles away. They were soldiers, yes, but their war was fought not with rifles or artillery, but with wrenches, blowtorches, and stubborn ingenuity. At one such repair camp near Smolensk, a strange vehicle arrived one August afternoon, towed behind a half-track that had just returned from an ambush site. It was smaller than anything the Germans usually handled, compact, open-topped, and dust-covered from the summer roads. At first glance, it resembled one of their own Kübelwagens, the light utility cars favored by Wehrmacht officers. But as soon as it rolled into the yard, the mechanics gathered around, murmuring with curiosity. Painted on its side was a faint white star, unmistakably American. The soldiers had captured a Jeep. The vehicle had been found abandoned after a skirmish with Soviet partisans, who had apparently been supplied by Allied airdrops. The Jeep, likely flown in as part of Lend-Lease support to the Red Army, had fallen into German hands by chance. To the mechanics, it was an alien artifact, a small machine that looked as though it had rolled straight out of a different age of engineering. Unteroffizier Ernst Muller, a veteran mechanic from Hamburg, was the first to climb into the driver's seat. He had spent the last 3 years working on everything from Panzer IIIs to Opel Blitz trucks, and he knew the quirks of German engines by heart. But when he turned his attention to the captured Jeep, his brow furrowed in fascination. The instrument panel was simple, clean, without the clutter of gauges and switches that fill most German vehicles. The steering felt light. The gearbox clicked easily, unlike the stiff resistance of a Kübelwagen. And the suspension, leaf springs that gave the car a certain bounce, seemed almost playful. The mechanics crowded around as Muller and his assistant, Feldwebel Rudi Hartmann, began inspecting it. They popped the hood and stared at the compact, efficient engine inside. "It's American simplicity," Hartmann muttered, half in admiration, half disbelief. The components were arranged with practical logic. Nothing over-engineered, nothing unnecessary. The air filter, the spark plugs, the carburetor, all easy to access. "We build our vehicles like watches," Muller said quietly, "but they build theirs like hammers, strong, and anyone can use them." Over the next few hours, the team worked to get the Jeep running again. The oil was low, the fuel line had been cut, and the tires were soft, but there was no major damage. By nightfall, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Muller climbed back into the seat, turned the ignition, and, to everyone's amazement, the little machine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. The engine sound was different from the deep growl of German trucks. It had a crisp, confident hum, like a creature eager to run. The men laughed as they watched Muller drive slow circles around the depot yard. The Jeep moved easily over ruts and puddles, its small wheels biting into the dirt with surprising confidence. The German Kübelwagen, by contrast, was known for being temperamental, its engine prone to overheating and its performance poor in mud. But this American machine, this Willys, as one of them read from the faded emblem on the hood, seemed to dance across the uneven ground as though it had been built for it. Soon, word of the captured Jeep spread among nearby units. Officers came to see it, curious about the craftsmanship of their enemy's allies. They brought their drivers, their engineers, even a few Panzer commanders, who studied its simplicity with quiet respect. The Wehrmacht prided itself on precision engineering, on complexity turned to efficiency, but here was something that challenged that philosophy. A car so straightforward that any soldier could repair it, yet so reliable that it could survive weeks in combat without much care. By the following week, the Jeep had become a favorite among the mechanics. They used it to fetch supplies from nearby villages, to ferry officers to observation points, even to haul food from a field kitchen. It handled everything with ease. One day, after a sudden summer downpour, the yard turned to mud. The mechanics, half amused, half skeptical, decided to put the Jeep to the test. While their Kübelwagen spun helplessly in the muck, the American vehicle plowed forward, its small engine humming steadily, its four-wheel drive biting through the sludge like a creature born for such terrain. That evening, sitting around their makeshift table of ammo crates, the men talked about it endlessly. "It's not beautiful," said Hartmann, lighting a cigarette. "But it works. It just works." Muller nodded, staring into his tin cup of coffee. "If we had these at the front," he said softly, "we could move supplies twice as fast, fix twice as many tanks." There was a pause, the kind that settles when a truth is too uncomfortable to admit out loud. "We overthink everything," he added, "and they just make it work." By the end of that month, the Jeep had been unofficially adopted by the repair crew. They painted over the white star with field gray, though the outline still faintly showed beneath. They named it their Klein Army, the Little American. Every man in the camp had taken a turn behind its wheel, laughing like boys at how easily it jumped ditches or climbed steep slopes. For the weary mechanics of the Wehrmacht, surrounded by the grinding monotony of war, it became more than a machine. It was a small symbol of wonder, a glimpse into how differently another nation thought about war, movement, and machines. What none of them knew, of course, was how deeply that small encounter would affect them. Years later, when the war was over and Germany lay in ruins, men like Muller and Hartmann would remember that Jeep. They would recall how it defied everything they'd been taught about engineering, about efficiency, about what made a machine truly good. And they would admit, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a laugh, that in all their years of working with German vehicles, they had never driven anything quite like it. But that understanding, that moment of admiration amid destruction, was still far ahead. For now, in the summer of 1943, deep in the heart of occupied Russia, a handful of Wehrmacht mechanics sat around a small fire, listening to the rain patter on the Jeep's hood. They talked of engines, of design, of the quiet marvel that was American practicality. In the distance, thunder rolled like artillery. Tomorrow would bring new orders, new repairs, and new broken machines to fix. Yet in that fleeting moment, under the dim light of the stormy night, they were no longer soldiers, only men who loved the art of making things work. Autumn came quickly to the eastern front. The golden wheat fields of August had turned to cold mud, and the winds carried the promise of another brutal Russian winter. In the small repair camp outside Smolensk, the once vibrant hum of industry had slowed. Fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer, and every vehicle that rolled in seemed a little more battered than the last. Yet amidst the fatigue and uncertainty, one constant presence remained, the captured Jeep, still affectionately known as their Klein Army. By now, it had become indispensable. The Wehrmacht mechanics relied on it for everything, towing smaller vehicles, scouting damaged supply routes, and carrying messages between repair depots. The men treated it with an odd mixture of pride and superstition. Whenever something broke down, the Jeep was the first thing they used to haul it in. And remarkably, despite the constant strain, it never failed them. One morning, as a pale mist hung over the camp, Muller and Hartmann prepared to take the Jeep on a supply run to a forward unit 20 kilometers away. The road ahead was uncertain. Partisans were active, and the forest roads were little more than mud and broken branches. Still, the little machine started easily, its engine cutting to the cold air like a clean note. They set off with 2 more mechanics in the back, passing the endless lines of retreating carts, field kitchens, and weary infantry trudging through the muck. The Jeep moved quickly, bouncing lightly over holes and ruts where even motorcycles struggled. It was small enough to weave between abandoned trucks and artillery pieces, and its steady rhythm made the journey almost peaceful. As they drove, Muller couldn't help comparing it to the German vehicles he knew so well. The Kubel wagon, though sturdy, often faltered in terrain like this. The steering was stiff, the suspension unforgiving. The Opel Blitz trucks, reliable on paved roads, became helpless in deep mud. But this American design, light compact, with just enough power, handled it all with grace. "It's not fast," Hartmann said over the engine noise, "but feels alive." Muller smiled faintly. It was built for soldiers, not engineers. They reached the front-line outpost by mid-afternoon. The troops there, gaunt and muddy, stared at the vehicle in disbelief. Most had never seen anything like it. When Muller explained where it came from, they surrounded it, asking questions, touching its surfaces like it was something exotic. One corporal, a former mechanic before the war, whistled and said, "If we had these everywhere, the Soviets would never outmove us." It was said half-jokingly, but everyone felt the truth in it. They offloaded the supplies, engine belts, spare spark plugs, and the few precious cans of oil they still had, and rested briefly before heading back. As they prepared to leave, a Luftwaffe officer approached, curious about the Jeep. He asked to take it for a short drive, and Muller obliged. The officer returned after only a few minutes, grinning like a boy. "This thing could drive over the moon," he said, shaking his head. Unbelievable, but the war, indifferent to such moments, crept ever closer. Within weeks, the Soviet counteroffensive began pushing west again. The repair camp was ordered to relocate, packing up machinery and tools, moving deeper into Belarus. The roads, once difficult, became nearly impassable. Trucks bogged down, tanks broke tracks, and horses collapsed from exhaustion. Through it all, the Jeep led the way, scouting ahead for passable routes, ferrying men and messages through terrain that no German vehicle could manage. During one desperate night march, a supply truck loaded with fuel became stuck in a marshy stretch of road. The men tried everything, logs, chains, brute force, but it wouldn't move. The risk was enormous. If they abandoned the truck, they would lose their last reserves of fuel, and if they stayed, they risked capture. Muller, thinking quickly, hitched the Jeep to the truck using a chain. The others laughed. The idea of the tiny American car pulling a 3-ton truck seemed absurd. But when he engaged the low gear and the 4-wheel drive, the Jeep dug in, its tires spinning but not surrendering. Slowly, inch by inch, the truck began to move. By the time dawn broke, both vehicles were free. The laughter that followed was half disbelief, half reverence. In that moment, even the officers were silent. "If we could build something like this," one of them said quietly, "we might win this war yet." But everyone knew that the German factories were producing fewer vehicles by the month. Allied bombers pounded them relentlessly, and steel was rationed so tightly that every bolt mattered. As the months dragged on, the Jeep became a symbol of endurance, not just a tool, but a reminder of a world beyond the chaos. Its design seemed to whisper something simple but profound, that war machines didn't have to be perfect, only practical. For men accustomed to the overcomplicated precision of German engineering, that idea was almost philosophical. When winter finally came, it came with vengeance. Snow covered the roads, ice choked the rivers, and engines froze overnight. The Wehrmacht, unprepared once again for the Russian cold, began to crumble. Vehicles refused to start. Tanks were abandoned and columns stalled for days. Yet the Jeep, somehow, still ran. The men had wrapped its engine in tarpaulins at night, drained and reheated the oil and metal cans over small fires, and coaxed it back to life each dawn. Even in sub-zero temperatures, it sputtered and roared, refusing to give up. It carried food to freezing infantrymen, towed wounded sleds back from the front, and ferried officers across frozen fields. Once, during a blizzard, Muller and Hartmann drove for 8 hours through snow so thick they could barely see the hood. They followed only the faint outlines of telegraph poles, their breath freezing to their scarves. When they finally reached a stranded platoon, half the men were frostbitten, their rifles crusted with ice. The Jeep's engine, though rattling, was still warm. They crowded around it for heat, touching its metal as though it were a living thing. By early 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively. The Red Army's advance forced the Germans to retreat westward in disarray. The repair units, once well organized, now worked in chaos, patching vehicles just enough to move before packing up again. Supplies dwindled to nothing. Many of the mechanics were killed or captured, but somehow der Kleine Army survived. Muller drove it through burning villages and across frozen rivers, often under fire. The paint was chipped, the fenders dented, but it never quit. One day, after weeks of retreat, the Jeep's front axle finally cracked. The men stood around it in silence, knowing they had no parts left to fix it. "So this is how it ends," Hartmann said quietly. "Not in battle, just worn out." Muller knelt beside it, brushing the snow from the hood. He said nothing for a long time, then placed his hand gently on the steering wheel. "It's done more than any of us," he murmured. They stripped it for tools and packed what they could, but they couldn't bring themselves to destroy it, as was standard with abandoned equipment. Instead, they rolled it to the edge of a frozen field and left it there, half buried in snow, facing west. They walked away without looking back. Months later, when Soviet troops passed through that area, a Red Army mechanic reportedly found the Jeep, partially covered in ice but largely intact. He thawed it, repaired a few minor faults, and started it up again. It ran. The Germans were long gone, but the little American car drove once more, changing hands, changing uniforms, surviving a war that destroyed everything else. When the war finally collapsed in 1945, it did so with a kind of exhausted inevitability. Germany's armies retreated on all fronts. Cities burned under Allied bombardment, and the remnants of divisions that had once spanned half a continent were reduced to ragged columns of starving men. Among them were the survivors of the 3rd Panzer Division's Repair Corps, men like Unteroffizier Ernst Müller and Feldwebel Rudi Hartmann, who had spent the last months of the war scavenging for scrap metal, cannibalizing wrecks, and doing whatever they could to keep a dying army moving for one more day. They had left their beloved Klein Army behind in the snow that winter near Minsk, and though they had more pressing concerns, food, survival, the ceaseless advance of the Red Army, the image of that little Jeep remained with them. In those final months, it came to symbolize something larger than just a machine. It was the embodiment of everything they had come to understand too late. That practicality and resilience were more valuable than perfection. That simplicity could win wars where precision failed. By April, Muller's unit had disintegrated. He was captured near Königsberg by Soviet forces after his last vehicle, a worn-out Opel truck, finally broke down in the mud. Hartmann was taken weeks later, in a different sector, while trying to reach the west. Like so many captured soldiers, they were sent to labor camps deep in the Soviet Union. The war for them did not end in 1945. It simply changed shape. Years passed in those camps. Men worked, fell ill, vanished. The former Wehrmacht mechanics found themselves once again repairing engines, this time for Soviet trucks, tractors, and even tanks. Ironically, they came to admire some of these Soviet designs as well. Simple, crude, but durable, it reminded them of that American Jeep. Muller would sometimes talk about it quietly at night, in the dim light of the barracks stove. "It was the best machine I ever touched," he'd say, and the others would nod. There was no bitterness in his tone, just a kind of resigned respect. When Muller finally returned to Germany in 1949, he was a thin, silent man of 40, older than his years. His hometown of Hamburg was in ruins, its factories bombed to rubble. He found work as a mechanic once again, this time repairing the vehicles of a country learning to rebuild itself. The cars were civilian now, Volkswagens, Opel Records, and, occasionally, American-made Jeeps left behind by the occupying forces. One afternoon, while working at a small garage on the outskirts of the city, he saw a familiar silhouette drive past. Squat, square, unmistakable. A Willys Jeep, painted green, with the white star still on the hood. The driver wore a British uniform. Muller froze for a moment. His mind pulled sharply back to the muddy roads of Smolensk and the laughter of his old crew. He stepped outside, watching as the vehicle rattled away into the city traffic. For the first time in years, he smiled. In the following decade, as Germany rebuilt, many former Wehrmacht soldiers found work in engineering, automotive production, and logistics. Their experiences during the war, particularly with machinery, became an unspoken foundation for the technical revival of post-war industry. When West Germany began developing its own civilian cars again, engineers spoke quietly of the lessons learned from American design. They didn't say it openly, but everyone knew that part of what shaped the next generation of German vehicles was not pride, but humility, the realization that efficiency could coexist with simplicity. Hartmann, who had survived years in a Soviet camp before eventually settling in Bavaria, kept in touch with Muller through letters. They wrote sparingly, mostly about work and family, but sometimes about the war in ways that only men who had lived through it could. In one letter from 1954, Hartmann wrote, "Do you remember that little Jeep? I saw one here in a U.S. Army convoy, still going strong. We never had one like it, Not before. Not since. Sometimes I think that machine was the truest piece of engineering I ever saw. Honest, direct, no nonsense. We thought we built better, but we built too clever. They built to last. Muller kept that letter in a small box on his workbench for years. Every so often, he would take it out and read it while cleaning tools or adjusting carburetors, and he would nod to himself. He never told his apprentices much about the war, but he would often lecture them about simplicity, how every part of the machine should have a purpose, and how a design must serve the man, not the other way around. Never overcomplicate, he'd say. The best machine is the one that just works. Meanwhile, the world changed. The Jeep, born as a wartime tool, became a global icon. Civilians began driving them across beaches and mountains, unaware that these little cars had once carried messages to the Eastern Front or ferried wounded soldiers across frozen fields. They became symbols of freedom and endurance, stripped of their original military burden. In 1962, nearly 2 decades after the war's end, Muller visited a small museum exhibition in Munich about wartime vehicles. Among the restored tanks, motorcycles, and artillery pieces, there was a single Jeep, painted in its original olive drab, its white star gleaming under the lights. A small plaque beside it read, Willys MB, U.S. Army, 1943, used extensively by Allied and Lend-Lease forces. He walked slowly around it, his hand brushing the edge of the hood. The smell of oil and canvas filled the air, and for a moment he could almost hear the laughter of his comrades again, the hum of the engine, the crackle of a campfire, the quiet admiration of men who had seen too much but still marveled at a good piece of engineering. When a young museum attendant approached, Muller asked if the vehicle still ran. Yes, sir, the man said proudly. Completely restored. Still drives beautifully. Muller smiled faintly. Of course it does, he murmured. They always did. He stood there for a long time, lost in thought, before finally turning to leave. Outside, Munich bustled with new cars, Beetles, BMWs, sleek Mercedes, all products of a reborn nation. Yet none of them, in his eyes, carried the same quiet perfection as that little American Jeep. That evening, he wrote another letter to Hartmann. I saw one again today, he wrote. Same as before, still running. It made me think. Maybe we all learned something from that little car, though we didn't realize it at the time. It was never about power or pride. It was about purpose. Everything it had, it needed, nothing more. That's the lesson I took from it. Maybe that's what we lost during the war, not the battle, but the sense of purpose. Hartmann replied weeks later, in handwriting shakier than before. You're right, old friend, he wrote. Machines tell the truth, even when men don't. And that one told us something important. That good engineering doesn't serve ideology. It serves humanity. By the 1970s, 3 decades after the war that had reshaped the world, Germany was no longer a place of ruins, but of reconstruction and industry. Cities that had once been burned to their foundations were now filled with factories, highways, and the constant hum of progress. For men like Ernst Muller and Rudi Hartmann, that transformation was both miraculous and bittersweet. They had spent their lives repairing, rebuilding, and perfecting machines, first for destruction and then for creation. But the memories of what they had seen, and the strange little Jeep that had opened their eyes, never left them. Muller had long since retired from his garage by then, his hands stiff but his mind sharp. He lived quietly on the outskirts of Hamburg, in a small flat filled with tools he could no longer use and photographs of engines, vehicles, and old friends. Hartmann, his wartime comrade, still wrote to him from Bavaria, though the letters came less frequently now, each one marked by the slow hand of age. They no longer spoke of wars they once had. Instead, they spoke of machines, tractors, trucks, the new cars flooding the Autobahn, and how the principles of simplicity and reliability had at last become the global standard. In 1974, Muller received a letter from a university in Stuttgart. A young historian was writing a book about wartime engineering and wanted to interview veterans who had served as mechanics. Muller hesitated at first, wary of talking about the past. But eventually, curiosity and the old instinct to explain how things worked overcame him. He agreed. The historian arrived one cold morning in November, a polite the spectacled man in his 30s who carried a tape recorder and a notebook. He spoke gently, asking about factory maintenance, fuel shortages, the challenges of the Eastern Front. Muller answered as best he could, his voice calm but distant. Then, as the conversation drifted toward captured Allied equipment, the historian asked almost casually, "Did you ever encounter any foreign vehicles during your service?" Muller paused for a long time. The ticking of the clock filled the silence. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said softly, "an American Jeep." For the next hour, he spoke in slow, careful German, describing the day it arrived in their camp, how the men had marveled at its construction, how it had outperformed everything they had, how it had carried them through mud, snow, and retreat. His tone carried no bitterness, only quiet respect. "It wasn't a miracle," he said, "just good sense. Everything we overdesigned, they simplified. Everything we tried to control, they made flexible. That machine taught us something, even in defeat." The historian listened, captivated. When he asked what would become of the Jeep, Muller smiled faintly. "We left it in the snow," he said, "but I've always imagined it kept going. Those things usually did." The story found its way into the historian's book, published a few years later under the title Engines of War, The Men Who Kept the Machines Moving. In one small section, buried among accounts of tanks and aircraft, was a paragraph about a group of Wehrmacht mechanics who captured an American Jeep and came to admire its design. It quoted Muller directly. "We never had vehicles like it, and we never forgot it." The book was modestly successful, and though Muller never sought attention, his name appeared briefly in footnotes and citations. For him, that was enough. The idea that someone might remember not just battles, but the mechanics, the men who worked in mud and grease, who fought with tools instead of rifles, gave him a quiet satisfaction. By the time the 1980s came, Muller's world had grown smaller. The old letters from Hartmann had stopped. When he finally received word through a mutual acquaintance that Hartmann had passed away, he spent the evening sitting by his window, the last letter from his friend in his lap. It was the one that spoke of the Jeep, of honesty in engineering, of machines that serve humanity. He read it again, tracing the faded ink with his thumb. Outside, cars hissed along wet streets, their headlights cutting through the rain. Somewhere in that modern traffic, he thought, there were descendants of that same simple design, machines built on the same principles, carrying people through peace instead of war. It comforted him to think that something good had survived. In 1987, on his 78th birthday, Muller received a small parcel in the post. It came from the same historian who had interviewed him years earlier. Inside was a photograph taken at a restoration event in France. A Willys Jeep, fully restored, olive drab and gleaming. On the back, the historian had written, "Perhaps not yours, but one just like it, still running." Muller framed the photograph and placed it on his workbench, beside his old tools. In the quiet evenings, he would sit and look at it, his thoughts drifting between the past and the present. The Jeep had become for him more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of what humanity could achieve when it built things not out of arrogance or ideology, but out of clarity and purpose. He passed away a few years later, in the spring of 1991, when his belongings were sorted by his daughter. She found the framed photograph, the letters from Hartmann, and a small notebook filled with sketches of engines, some German, some foreign, and one unmistakably of a Jeep. On the final page, written in his neat, aging hand, were the words, "We built machines for a war we could not win. But that little American car, it was built for something better, to endure." Decades later, historians and collectors would continue to marvel at the Jeep's story, how it became one of the most recognizable and reliable vehicles ever made, how it crossed every front, served every army, and survived every environment. Few would know about the German mechanics who once drove one to the Eastern Front and discovered in it a lesson that transcended sides. But in the quiet, unseen corners of memory, their admiration lingered. For all its iron and fire, the Second World War was also a war of ideas, of philosophies about how to build, how to organize, how to endure. The Jeep, born out of necessity, proved that brilliance did not always come from complexity, nor strength from rigidity. Sometimes the most enduring designs, like the most enduring truths, were the simplest ones. And so, In the long aftermath of that war, amid all the memorials and monuments, there remained one unspoken story of a handful of weary mechanics in gray uniforms, somewhere in the vast expanse of the Eastern Front, who climbed into a captured vehicle, started its engine, and realized, perhaps for the first time, that ingenuity, in its purest form, belonged to no single nation.